And therefore our next speaker, whom I heard speaking some time ago in London and was extremely impressed, and he actually remembered me, so I'm even doubly impressed for that, is Simon Giles. And Simon is the director of the Intelligent Cities Strategy, an Accenture operating out of the UK, but with an international remit. He leads a global strategy team that is focused on developing strategies for existing and new build cities that have technology at the core. And he currently works with city governments and developers in Asia, Europe, the Middle East, and the Americas. You can see our panel is an extremely well-traveled group this morning, as well as advising the World Economic Forum on smart grids, the future of urban development, and the green growth strategies. And he's currently working on green growth strategies and innovation clusters in a number of developing economies, and is developing case studies for presentations at COP17 and Rio Plus 20. He's also engaged in the Global Green Growth Forum, OECD, and World Bank Green Growth Programs. You can see he's an extremely busy man. We're delighted to have him. Simon.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Peter, and it's always a pleasure to be in Dublin. I've been here for a couple of days, and it's always nice to be here. And as if by design, moving on from Sally's comments, hopefully what I'm going to talk to you today is a pretty pertinent case study in public-private collaboration, some work that myself and my team did in Guadalajara, and it's still ongoing. And I'll try and cover it in 10 minutes. This would normally take a lot longer, so it's going to be a little bit of a canter through, but hopefully we'll be able to cover some of this more in a Q&A. So, a little bit of background on the project, very briefly. Within Mexico, there was, at the federal government level, an acceptance that there was an opportunity to grow the economy in the creative digital economy space. And behind that was the idea that they wanted to attract back the diaspora of Mexicans that are working on the west coast of the US in video gaming and television and film manufacturing to come back to Mexico. So through Pro Mexico, they set up a competition amongst the cities of Mexico to host this new cluster development. Through the process of assessment, it came out that Guadalajara was decided to be the winning city. And through that process, they then started to develop a master plan for what that looks like. And this is a fairly large site. It's about 70 acres right in the heart of Guadalajara, and it will require a pretty fundamental redevelopment. So rather than going through the entire master plan, which we were participating in with Arup and MIT, I wanted to focus specifically on governance, because I think this is what's really innovative about this development from my perspective. And the challenge, if any of you know Mexican politics, is that there was a general election that was held last July. And what we often find in development context is that during this political cycle of elections, the interest in the development waxes and wanes depending on where you are in the cycle. And what we wanted to do was focus on how do we deal with that challenge? And more importantly, if this development was the child of the previous administration, how do we avoid it becoming killed during the next administration if there is a change of administration? So that was one aspect of what we were trying to achieve. The second is that whenever you're doing urban redevelopment, what becomes obvious is the standard real estate model of the government sell the land cheap, a master developer buys the land cheap, and the majority of the economic profit is generated during that early development process, where the master developer takes it through planning permission and master planning, and then sells off parcels of land for redevelopment. The challenge of that model is that the people that currently live and work within that space are the people that see the least amount of economic profit generated. And therefore, we wanted to try and address that question of how do we retain some of that economic profit within the community and engage community in the development process? And is it possible to set up a new governance structure and a new business model that's more equitable and can be replicated both throughout Mexico and more broadly? So there were three specific challenges that we were trying to address. The first was, how do we manage that period of political transition? Is it possible to depoliticize the development process to some extent? The second is, how do we increase stakeholder equity in this process so that some of that economic profit is captured? And then finally, what do we need to do with respect to the legal frameworks of incorporation to make sure that the governance structure is effective and can be sustained throughout the transition? So we designed a structure that had 5 principles at the heart, and I'll quickly go through each one of them. The first is a formation of a trust with specific covenants about how the land development would develop. The second is to think more flexibly about the type of enterprise status that this incorporation would form. The third is about ensuring inclusiveness and representation of a broad section of civil society. And then the fourth, which I think is the most important to some extent, is how do we make sure that social enterprise is right at the heart of the development? And then finally, how do we make that balance in the public-private collaboration between public and private participation and incorporation of the third sector into this exercise? So very briefly, at the heart of the structure was the formation of a trust. So rather than the master developer being a normal for-profit enterprise, we developed a trust, and the trust would be effectively the master developer, but the trust would have specific covenants enshrined in its articles of incorporation that would protect the legacy of the development throughout the political cycles. And by creating a trust, we were naturally depoliticizing the process, but also taking away the profit maximization motive and taking shareholder activities away from it. So this was something that had trustees, and the trustees were formed from a broad section of civil society, and I'll come on to that in a section. The most important thing is to get the balance that the trust should be operated like a for-profit company, with all the discipline that you would expect in a commercial master developer. The only difference of this organization is that rather than having shareholders at the heart, it has trustees. So think of this organization just like you would a normal for-profit enterprise with all the discipline that you would expect. But rather than shareholders, we have trustees. But actually, it's a bit more complicated than that, because the trust needs a natural balance of power. So we separated it into 2 parts. The CCD trust was responsible for the master development itself and is an operational entity and is responsible for the day-to-day development of the site. But sitting above that was a foundation, and the foundation effectively held the purse strings for the development. And it was important that we created this balance of power between the trust and the foundation, such that neither could operate without the other. And that, therefore, we put in there a natural check and balance for abuse of power. But when it comes to the funding of the site, which is absolutely critical, what we wanted to do was make sure that the foundation could draw funding from a number of different sources, including government initially. So much of the initial funding for the acquisition of the land for the trust was going to come from the public sector. But also it could attract development bank financing and philanthropic funding with specific covenants around how that money was to be used. But what was clear was the money that went into the foundation could never exit, and therefore it had to be used. The covenants of the foundation ensured that any profit that was generated throughout the entire life cycle of the development had to be reinvested and couldn't go back out to the shareholders that were involved. One final point on this. In order to scale to a multi-billion-dollar investment, there needed to be a balance between using shareholder equity, or in this case, stakeholder equity, within the trust, could also be leveraged with debt finance. So thinking about what the enterprise status was of the foundation was absolutely critical. And that took quite a lot of behind-the-scenes negotiation with lawyers, both at the federal, state, and local government level, to make sure that we could incorporate the trust in such a way that it could hold debt finance. In terms of the representation on the trust, we wanted to ensure the maximum representation of civil society. So coming to Sally's point about needing to ensure that we don't form cliques, we went to great pains to make sure that that was enshrined within the articles of the trust. So the trustees were brought from, there are 100 trustees. sorry, there are 100 trustees, and they were brought from government, business, finance, and civil society. And in each case, they were elected, and they could only be elected a third at a time every 3 years. And the purpose of that was to avoid cabals forming within the trust itself. The chair would be elected by the trustees, and they would have a board that brought executive management to the table. And then sitting beneath that board were a series of committees that drew on civil society to perform the academic excellence that was necessary in order to execute the mission. So in addition to the trustees, there was an opportunity for the trust to draw down on specific expertise. So the fourth part, and I think the most important part, was the fact that enshrined within the Articles of Incorporation was a specific social enterprise mission. So I mentioned the fact that none of the economic profit could exit the foundation at any point in time. But more specifically, as the development became successful and started generating retained earnings, it was specifically enshrined that the investments could only go to the areas surrounding the cluster. What we wanted to be clear was that when people left the area that was being developed, they often leave to the surrounding neighborhoods. And the people that are going to be moving into those neighborhoods, we wanted to be the beneficiaries of the success of the cluster itself. So as the cluster became more successful, the people that were servicing the cluster would become the beneficiaries of the social enterprise activities. So all the investments have to be made in the surrounding neighborhoods, in education, healthcare, housing, etc. And as a consequence, you create a natural security buffer around the site because you're aligning the interests of the surrounding communities with the cluster itself. So the success of the cluster is in the interests of the surrounding communities and vice versa. So finally, before I move on, responsible private enterprise is important with any development. It would not be possible to do a development of this scale without the private sector involvement. But what we wanted to be clear about was that the private sector were involved and the market was involved on the terms of the trust and with a specific license to operate. So when it comes to the service provision within the trust, whether that's private development within parcels of land, within the master development, or whether it's providing utility infrastructure, or whether it's providing market services, mobile phone services, for example, each service was identified and assessed as to who was the best participant to fund and deliver those services. Now, in some cases, that's the public sector, where there isn't a clear value proposition that can be recouped by the private sector. But in the case of things like water and energy utility infrastructure, there was an opportunity for the trust to be able to issue longer-term concessions to the private sector, thereby reducing the capital requirements of the trust to do the development. But in a case of mobile phones, for example, there's a very clear market economy for how mobile phone provision is created, and there's no necessary role for the trust in managing the delivery of those services. And it's important to go through systematically the services that are provided at each stage and to understand what is the role and responsibility of each person in the process. So I'll leave it there because I think my time is up. But hopefully this gives some examples of how we might be able to think about new development models within both developed and developing world cities that drive towards this question of public-private collaboration, but also protect the interests of civil society and the people that are most vulnerable. Because it's the people that get evicted from the site that lose most in this process. So how can we include them in the development itself? Thank you.